This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, ready to jump into a story that could have totally flipped the script in World War II.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it is. We're talking about the Battle of Midway. But we're not just hitting the highlights, the explosions, the ships going down. We want to figure out why this fight way out in the Pacific mattered so much.
Because most folks just remember the what, not the why.
Exactly. And trust me, there's some seriously cool stuff to uncover, like, did you know Codebreakers basically handed the U.S. a win?
Seriously important stuff.
Big time. Plus, this tiny island, Midway Atoll itself, the location was key. And then there's the debate, was it pure U.S. genius, or did Japan kind of stumble into defeat?
Well, to get why Midway's so important, gotta set the stage, right? Japan was on a roll in the early war.
Yeah, everyone knows about Pearl Harbor, but they weren't done there.
Not even close. They were grabbing territory all over Southeast Asia. Places like the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Unstoppable, almost.
Almost like that friend who joins every club, signs up for everything, and then they're like, why am I so tired all the time?
It's exactly. Stretched thin. And Admiral Yamamoto, the brains behind Japan's strategy, he knew this.
He was smart, I'll give him that.
Oh, brilliant. But to rule the Pacific, he had to wipe out the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
So Midway, that was his chance to do it.
Bingo. Yamamoto figured a big win at Midway. The U.S. backs off. Japan's in control. High stakes, right?
No kidding. Okay, so Midway itself, it wasn't just some random island they picked for a fight.
Right. Midway Atoll, the location, that's the key. Think of it as the midpoint between the U.S. and Asia.
So whoever controlled Midway, they basically had the upper hand in the entire Pacific.
You got it. Japan takes Midway. They're close enough to threaten Hawaii, even the U.S. West Coast. Game changer.
But here's where it gets crazy. The U.S. codebreakers, they'd cracked the Japanese codes. They knew what was coming.
Huge advantage. Admiral Nimitz, the U.S. Pacific Fleet commander, he used that intel to set a trap, an ambush at Midway.
Next level chess match out there. So June 4th to 7th, 1942, that's when it all went down.
Chaotic, naval combat, air combat. Japanese planes hit Midway, but the U.S. was ready. And then U.S. dive bombers from carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, they launched a counterattack. Brutal.
And that's where we hear those famous names. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Japanese carriers, all gone in hours.
Just like that. Catastrophic loss. Not just the ships, the pilots too. So many skilled pilots gone.
Because those experienced pilots, they couldn't just replace those guys overnight.
Exactly. Huge blow to Japan's fighting power. So, yeah, big defeat for Japan. But how did this one battle turn the whole tide of the war? What made Midway so impactful on the bigger picture?
That's what I want to know.
Multifaceted impact. First, no more offensive power for Japan. They're on defense for the rest of the war. No more surprise attacks like Pearl Harbor.
So no more Pearl Harbors, essentially.
Exactly. Second, the U.S. industrial machine, it's in overdrive now, building carriers faster than Japan can sink them. War of attrition, and the U.S. had the manpower and resources to win that.
Like a boxer who can take a punch and just keeps coming back stronger.
Perfect analogy. And then the morale boost for the U.S. They finally beat Japan, proving it could be done. Huge psychological win.
Tactical win, strategic turning point, and a psychological victory. Triple whammy. But earlier you said historians argue about how important Midway really was. What's the debate?
Different views. You got traditionalists, they say Midway, that's the turning point, no question. Good guys win, bad guys lose, end of story.
Simple, neat.
But then there's the revisionists. They say, hold on, the U.S. got lucky, Japan made huge mistakes, their commanders messed up. It wasn't just American brilliance. Adds nuance, right?
Yeah, definitely. More to the story than meets the eye.
And then the post-revisionists, they say Midway mattered, but the U.S.'s industrial power, that's what won the war in the long run.
So it's not just about one battle. It's the bigger picture, the resources, the ability to outproduce.
Right. History is rarely black and white, always multiple perspectives.
True. We've talked strategy debates, but real people fought and died at Midway. Any personal stories that stand out?
Oh, tons. Admiral Nimitz, he praised the U.S. pilots, sinking those carriers, real skill and bravery. But on the Japanese side, Admiral Nagumo, their commander, totally shocked by the American attack, underestimated them big time. Fatal mistake.
Yeah, that didn't end well for him.
No. But one that gets me, Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8.
Sole survivor. Wow. Just shows the intensity of that fight.
Yeah. His whole squadron wiped out, attacking a Japanese carrier that, hear you, they flew straight into enemy defenses. Incredible bravery, but it was a doomed attack.
Just him left.
He ditched in the water, clung to a seat cushion for hours, hiding from Japanese patrols, rescued by a U.S. seaplane. Heroism, but also immense loss.
Powerful reminder of the human cost, the individual stories within the larger battle.
Exactly, and those stories often reveal more than the official reports. History is ultimately about people.
We've covered a lot, but feels like we've only just scratched the surface. Midway, a tactical win, a strategic turning point, the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance. But before we move on, you mentioned aircraft carriers earlier. Midway seems like a huge shift in how naval battles were fought, didn't it?
You're right. Midway was a watershed moment for naval aviation. It proved, beyond a doubt, aircraft carriers, they were the new kings of the sea, not those massive battleships that ruled before.
Kind of poetic. Tiny atoll in the Pacific changes how naval warfare is done forever. No more big ships slugging it out at close range.
Right. Midway showed the incredible reach of carrier-based aircraft hitting targets hundreds of miles away. Completely changed the game.
And the impact of those lessons, they didn't stop there, right? Those tactics, the strategies, they were used in other battles throughout the Pacific.
Absolutely. Battles like the Philippine Sea, Light Gulf, all these crucial engagements, they showed how powerful carrier-based air power really was. Midway, that's where it all started, the turning point. The world realized naval warfare had entered a new era.
So before we go to part 2 of our deep dive into Midway, circling back to that debate about how significant the battle really was, all those different viewpoints from historians, is there a way to find some common ground? Can those perspectives work together?
That's a great question. It's about how we understand and interpret history. The truth, it often lies in the gray areas, not the extremes of total victory or just dumb luck. You got to consider multiple viewpoints, weigh the evidence, understand that interpreting history isn't simple.
Like piecing together a puzzle, right? All these different pieces, primary sources, historical accounts, strategies, and we're trying to assemble them to see the whole picture.
Exactly. And when you put together that Midway puzzle, you see it's a mix of things that led to the American victory. Brilliant strategy from the U.S. commanders, yes. Intelligence from the codebreakers, crucial. And Japan made mistakes, for sure.
But also that long game, the U.S.'s ability to just outproduce Japan, replace their losses, and keep the pressure on.
You nailed it. Midway, a turning point, but part of a bigger shift in power. It wasn't just that one event, it's part of a larger story.
So as we wrap up this part, I gotta ask, knowing how important Midway was, how do you think the Pacific War would have gone if Japan had won? If things had gone the other way?
Wow, that's the question, isn't it? Historians have debated that for decades. Japan takes Midway, their position in the Pacific, way stronger. A strategic base to threaten Hawaii, maybe even the U.S. West Coast. The whole war changes.
A total game changer.
No doubt. The psychological impact on the U.S., huge. The war probably drags on much longer. More losses on both sides.
Chilling thought. Really makes you realize how important Midway was and the incredible courage of everyone who fought there.
Absolutely. History isn't predetermined. Choices, courage, small events, they can have huge consequences. Midway proves that.
Well, every time we do one of these deep dives, we end up with more questions than answers. But that's what I love about history.
It keeps us thinking, exploring.
Exactly. So for anyone listening who's hooked, wants to learn more, what are some good resources? Where should we go to dig deeper into Midway?
Shattered Sword, the book by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, fantastic resource. Challenges the traditional view of the battle.
And what about for people who want to hear from the people who are actually there?
Primary sources, collections of letters, diaries, and oral histories. Those first-hand accounts, they give you a real sense of what it was like.
I agree. Those personal stories, they hit the hardest. They make history real. It's not just dates and battles. It's about real people.
Exactly. And those individual stories often offer insights that you just don't get from the history books.
So if you're fascinated by Midway, don't stop here. Read those books, listen to those stories, and come to your own conclusions.
That's the best part. History is a journey of discovery, constantly learning and reevaluating. And the Battle of Midway, that's a crucial part of that journey.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that curiosity alive.
You know, we're talking about those code breakers intercepting those Japanese plans. It's easy to forget how brilliant that was, what they pulled off.
Oh, for sure. It wasn't just grabbing messages. This was like solving some crazy hard puzzle, wasn't it?
Exactly. The Japanese, they were using this super sophisticated code system called JN-25. Cracking it was a massive undertaking.
So how'd they actually do it? What was the key to getting into those Japanese secrets?
Well, the U.S. Navy, they had been trying to break Japanese naval codes for years. They had some seriously sharp minds working on it. One key player, Joseph Rochefort, cryptanalyst, he and his team, stationed HYPO in Pearl Harbor, they were relentless.
I bet it was a lot of trial and error, late nights, endless coffee.
Oh, you can bet. But then, a breakthrough. They figured out that AF, that code name, the Japanese were using it for Midway Island.
So that tiny detail, a code name, that gave them the missing piece.
Exactly. Once they knew AF was Midway, they could unlock other parts of the messages, confirm the Japanese attack plan.
And that's what let Nimitz set up that counter ambush.
Exactly. Gave the U.S. a huge edge. They knew where the Japanese were going, when they were coming, even how many ships and planes they had.
Wow. It's kind of crazy to think the whole battle, it hinged on those codebreakers.
It shows you how important intelligence and codebreaking are in war. You could say the Battle of Midway. It was won in those dark rooms where those codebreakers work their magic, figuring out those messages.
Like a whole other battlefield, a secret war of brains.
Exactly. And the stakes? Sky high.
Okay, let's dig into the battle itself. Those 4 Japanese carriers that went down, what made them so vulnerable to the U.S. dive bombers?
A couple of things. First, bad timing for the Japanese, their carriers. They'd launched their planes to attack Midway, and they were refueling and rearming when those U.S. dive bombers showed up.
So they were caught with their pants down, defenses down.
You got it. And to make it worse, their flight decks, jammed with planes, fuel lines, munitions, it was a disaster waiting to happen.
One spark could set off a chain reaction.
And that's what happened. The U.S. dive bombers attacked, their bombs hit those carriers, started fires that spread like wildfire through those crowded flight decks.
I was reading about the Akagi, one of the Japanese carriers. Just a couple of bombs, but it was completely wrecked.
Oh yeah, the bombs hit the Akagi's hangar deck, full of fueled and armed planes. The explosions, so powerful, ripped up the flight deck, destroyed the ship.
It's insane how a few bombs could do so much damage.
Aircraft carriers, powerful but vulnerable, especially if they're caught by surprise. And it shows how skilled those U.S. dive bomber pilots were.
You mentioned the Japanese pilots earlier, how tough they were to replace. Tell me more about their training, why it was so hard to find new pilots.
The Japanese had this super intense pilot training program before the war. They picked the best of the best, and the training, brutal.
Like the U.S. Top Gun program.
Very much so. Those Japanese pilots, top-notch, highly skilled, experienced, dedicated, some of the best in the world.
So yeah, losing those pilots at Midway, that was a massive blow to the Japanese.
Couldn't replace them fast enough. As the war went on, their pilot quality dropped, and that gave the U.S. a big advantage in the air.
We talked about Ensign George Gay earlier, that sole survivor from Torpedo Squadron 8. What more can you tell me about his experience?
His story, it's amazing and heartbreaking. He was part of a squadron that attacked the Japanese carrier Hiryu. Imagine facing crazy anti-aircraft fighter attacks.
Flying straight into the heart of the Japanese defenses.
Incredibly brave, but their attack doomed from the start. His entire squadron shot down. Every single plane except his. He was the only one left.
It's hard to fathom what he went through.
He saw his buddies die, then ditched his own plane, had to hide from Japanese patrols, clung to a seat cushion in the water for hours, finally rescued by a U.S. seaplane.
Wow, that's intense. To go through all that and survive, incredible.
Ensign Gay, a testament to human resilience. And his story reminds us of the sacrifices so many made during the war.
You know, when we were discussing those different historical opinions on Midway, the traditionalists, the revisionists, the post-revisionists, it made me think about how history, it's often told by the winners, isn't it?
You hit the nail on the head.
Mm-hmm.
History always depends on your perspective.
Oh.
Who's telling the story, what evidence they focus on, their own biases. It all shapes how we understand events.
It's like that saying, history is written by the winners.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial to look at things from different angles, dig into primary sources, question what we think we know, and be aware of our own biases.
Dig deeper, go beyond the surface, get a more complete understanding of what happened.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying history so fascinating. It's a journey of discovering and reevaluating.
We've been focusing on the U.S. side of the Battle of Midway. What was Japan's reaction to this massive loss? What did it do to their morale, their strategy going forward?
Well, the Japanese government, they tried to downplay it at first. Didn't want to freak people out, so they censored news reports, tried to spin things in a positive light.
I guess that makes sense. You don't want to cause widespread panic.
Of course not. But within the military, they knew it was a disaster. They lost 4 crucial carriers, those veteran pilots, And the initiative in the Pacific.
So for them, a turning point too, but in a completely different way.
Absolutely. Midway forced them to change their plans, get defensive. Their dreams of conquering the Pacific shattered.
Must have been a tough pill to swallow, especially after all their wins early in the war.
Oh, for sure. Midway marked the start of their long retreat across the Pacific. From that point on, they were fighting a losing battle.
We were discussing aircraft carriers earlier and how vulnerable they could be. Midway was a turning point for naval warfare, but it also showed the risks of relying on these massive floating air bases.
You're right. Carriers, powerful weapons, but also easy targets. Their flight decks, wide open, perfect for enemy planes to attack.
And if that flight deck's out of commission, the whole carrier's useless.
Exactly. Losing a carrier, all those planes, the crew, it was a devastating blow.
So what lessons did the naval strategists learn from Midway? How to better protect these valuable ships?
Midway showed that air defense was paramount. You needed fighters to intercept those bombers and torpedo planes before they could reach the carrier.
Like a protective shield around the carrier.
That's a good way to put it. And they also had to get better at damage control. If a carrier got hit, they had to contain fires, repair the damage fast, keep the ship fighting.
So Midway wasn't just about sinking ships, it was about learning and adapting to new ways of fighting at sea.
You got it. Made naval strategists rethink their tactics, find new ways to protect those vital carriers.
You know, we've been talking big picture, but I want to zoom in for a second. What was it like for the sailors and airmen on those ships and planes? What was their daily life like?
Life on those ships, those remote islands, it was brutal. Cramped conditions, bad food, and the threat of attack, always there.
Must have been incredibly stressful knowing any minute you could be fighting for your life.
Oh, absolutely. Serving in the Pacific in World War II, incredible hardship. The combat, the tropical heat, diseases, being away from family, it was tough.
Makes you realize war isn't just about battles and winning. It's about the human experience, the sacrifices of those who served.
Couldn't agree more. Those stories of courage, of selflessness, those sacrifices, they're woven into the story of the Battle of Midway.
We talked about how Japan reacted to Midway, but what about back in the U.S.? How did that victory affect people back home?
It was exactly what they needed. Remember, up to that point, lots of defeats for the U.S. in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor still fresh in everyone's minds. The Philippines had fallen to the Japanese.
Yeah, the country was hurting.
So when news of Midway broke, it was huge. Celebration in the streets, newspapers going crazy, it was a big deal.
Like a sign that things were finally turning around.
Exactly. Midway gave people hope that Japan could be beaten.
And it helped get everyone behind the war effort.
Absolutely. Boosted morale, strengthened their commitment to win the war.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. Code breakers, strategies, sacrifices, historical debates. It's clear Midway was a turning point in World War II.
No doubt. A clash of titans, a battle that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific, helped the Allies win the war.
As we move on to explore Midway's aftermath, I want to focus on what happened after the battle. What were the long-term consequences for both the U.S. and Japan?
Great question. Midway had huge and lasting effects on both sides. It shaped the rest of the war in the Pacific, even influenced the world after the war.
Let's get into it. What were some of the key developments that happened after this crucial battle? What were the ripples that spread out from Midway?
One of the biggest consequences was that the momentum swung in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan was on the attack, expanding their empire like crazy. But after, they were forced to defend.
So it was the turning point, like we've been saying.
It was. From that point, the U.S. was able to go on the offensive. They launched counterattacks, pushing the Japanese back across the Pacific.
Like the tide turned and the U.S. rode that wave.
Perfect analogy. And as the U.S. pushed forward, their industrial strength, it really came into play. They poured resources and manpower into the Pacific.
We talked about that industrial advantage. How did it affect the battles after Midway?
The U.S., they built ships and planes at an unbelievable rate. They replaced their losses, expanded their fleet, while Japan struggled to keep up.
War of attrition, and the U.S. simply had more resources.
Exactly. And that advantage just got bigger as the war went on.
We've talked about strategy, industry, but what about the human cost? What happened to the men who fought in this brutal battle?
Midway, it resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The U.S. lost the carrier Yorktown, over 300 men. But Japan, they lost 4 carriers and over 3,000 men.
Makes you think about all the sacrifices those who served in the Pacific made during World War II.
It does. And the impact of those losses, it lasted long after the battle ended. families who lost loved ones, the veterans who carried the scars of war, physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives.
We've explored what happened right after Midway, but what about the bigger picture? How did it shape the Pacific War and the world after the war?
Well, winning at Midway was crucial for the Allies to win the war in the Pacific. It weakened Japan's navy, gave the Americans a morale boost, and shifted the momentum of the war.
It set the stage for those island-hopping campaigns that would eventually bring the U.S. to Japan's doorstep.
Exactly. And the lessons from Midway, like how important aircraft carriers and naval aviation were, they influenced naval strategy for decades.
So Midway's impact, it went far beyond the battle itself. It wasn't just a fight, it was a turning point that changed the course of history.
Absolutely. And as we explore Midway's legacy, we'll see even more about its lasting effects on the world.
You know, when people talk about World War II, they usually focus on the big battles in Europe, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the fall of Berlin. But Midway, this battle in the Pacific, it deserves to be up there with those other important moments.
I agree, 100%. Midway was a clash of empires, a battle that showed the courage and sacrifice on both sides, a turning point in the Pacific War that shaped the post-war world.
And as our deep dive continues, we'll uncover Midway's legacy, hear stories from those who were there, and learn from this epic battle that took place on that tiny atoll.
It's a journey of discovery, uncovering the hidden stories and the impact of this important event.
So get ready, because we're going even deeper into Midway. You know, we've talked about the strategy, the bravery, the losses, but what gets to me is just how huge the Pacific theater was in World War II. Not just a few islands, we're talking an ocean. An entire ocean.
You're right, and that adds a whole other level of difficulty to Midway. It wasn't just ships and planes fighting. It was about keeping those ships and planes supplied, moving things across thousands of miles of ocean. A logistical nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, sitting here, it's tough to grasp what it was like for those guys, those sailors and airmen stuck out in the middle of the Pacific, so far from home.
It's mind-boggling. To be on a ship, a tiny speck on that vast ocean, knowing at any moment you could be attacked. Or imagine being a pilot, flying over that endless water, not just worried about enemy fighters, but what if your plane breaks down or you run out of fuel?
Fighting the enemy, but also fighting the elements, the isolation, the fear.
And the mental strain on top of it all, being isolated, away from family and friends, knowing you could die any minute, that takes a toll.
Really makes you think. War isn't just about battles and who wins. It's about what those guys went through, their endurance, their resilience.
Absolutely. And those stories of courage, selflessness, sacrifice, they're all part of the Battle of Midway.
So we've covered a lot in our deep dive into Midway, the code breakers, the tactics, the sacrifices, the historical arguments, how it changed everything. But for anyone listening who's hooked and wants to learn more, what are some resources you'd recommend? Where can they go to explore this more?
Some really great books out there that go deep on Midway. Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully. Fantastic book. It challenges the traditional view of the battle.
And I bet there are documentaries, movies that bring this story to life on screen.
Definitely. The Battle of Midway, a documentary John Ford made during the war. It's amazing. Uses actual footage from the battle, filmed by Navy cameramen. And there's a newer movie, Midway, from a few years ago. It's Hollywood, so some drama added in, but it does a decent job with the main events and people involved.
And for folks who want to go beyond those accounts, the interpretations of the battle, how can they connect with the primary sources, the real stuff of history?
There are archives, online resources, the National Archives and Records Administration, the Library of Congress. Both have huge collections from World War II. Personal letters, diaries, photos, official documents from Midway itself.
I always find those primary sources the most impactful. They take you straight back, you hear those voices from the past, see what they saw.
Me too. There's something about reading a letter a sailor wrote right before a battle, or seeing a picture of the pilots getting ready for a mission. It brings history to life like nothing else can.
So to our listeners, if Midway's got you hooked, don't stop here. Read those books, watch the films, dig into the archives, and most importantly, come to your own conclusions.
That's what's so great about history. It's a conversation that never ends, constantly learning, questioning, reinterpreting, and Midway is a fascinating part of that conversation.
It's been amazing exploring this battle with you. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just in awe of those who fought at Midway, their courage, their sacrifices, and it really hits home how powerful history is. It teaches us, challenges us, connects us to the past.
Couldn't have said it better. Midway reminds us that even when things are at their darkest, human courage and ingenuity, they can shine through. And it shows how strong the human spirit is, how we overcome even the toughest challenges.
Until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that curiosity alive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.